Hello and welcome to the first instalment in a new series called Excel, celebrating the 40th anniversary of gigs, concerts and festivals that I've attended, the first of which took place in November 1980 when I was aged 14. The idea for the series came about during lockdown when I was poring through the multitude of ticket stubs that I had hoarded over the previous 4 decades. This series will provide the background to each gig as it reaches its 40th anniversary, starting with the first gig I attended without either of my parents in tow. Before I ventured out to gigs alone, there were of course many highlights. My father was a professional musician and erstwhile saxophone player with the Merseybeat band The Undertakers. This of course meant he had ready access to many a guest list. The first gig I remember was Booker T and the MGs in 1970 at the Liverpool Empire, supported by Blue Mink and Jimmy Ruffin, the Motown artist who had scored a UK and US hit with What Becomes of the Broken Hearted, and whose older brother David was a founder member of the Motown band The Temptations. It's highly likely that Jimmy took his memories of this particular concert to his grave when he died in 2014, recalling the heckling he received throughout his support slot by a certain yours truly, age 4, who in no uncertain terms let Jimmy know that he was rubbish and to get off the stage. Who could blame me? We were only there to see Booker T. Jones, Donald Duck Dunn and the rest of the Stax Recording in-house band rattle off the hits. My dad went backstage after the gig and saw Jimmy Ruffin pacing up and down his dressing room screaming, "Who was that pesky kid heckling me from the gallery?" Although I can't recall, over the next few months I was no doubt grounded from my Empire shenanigans. My gig opportunities were somewhat curtailed. During my early years, I would often go and watch my dad playing live. I remember a gig he did at the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool with supergroup Grims, comprising of members of Scaffold, Paul McCartney's brother Mike McGeer, pre-Tiswas era John Gorman, and Liverpool beat poet Roger McGough. The other half of the supergroup featured members of the Bonzo Dog Doodah band, led by Neil Innes, who had found fame by Monty Python and his band The Buttles, a Beatles pastiche that Eric Idle described as the Prefab Four. My only memory of the Grims gig is my dad flashing his false teeth at me between sax solos, whilst I sat on the balcony with my mum. My mum was also active in music, working as an artist manager in Liverpool. Her roster included a certain Michael Barrett from Cardiff, or Shakin' Stevens as he later became known. Once I reached my teens, I started to buy my first records. Nothing serious, mind. My first single was Bang Bang by B.A. Robertson. I also managed to secure Out of the Blue by Electric Light Orchestra and Regatta de Blanc by the Police in the Christmas of 1979. This coincided with my dad joining the Glitter Band in mid-1979, who we went to see at a less than half-full Liverpool Empire later that year. Glitter was back on the road after facing bankruptcy, and I would later see him in numerous sold-out university gigs during the 80s, including his farewell tour in 1997, Glitter's 25th anniversary road trip, which he strangely billed as a night out with the boys, could this be the last time. In late 1979, I bought my first album, Parallel Lines by Blondie. My mum took me to see them on the Eat to the Beat tour in January 1980 at the D-Side Leisure Centre. In the middle of 1980, my life was about to change forever. A friend of my mother's, John Hines to be precise, visited our house armed with 3 records that had me selling off my ELO and Blondie back catalogue in a matter of months. The 3 albums were Closer by Joy Division, Systems of Romance by Ultravox, and the self-titled debut album by the Wirral band Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. Within weeks, I was searching out cuts by John Fox, the Psychedelic Furs, Human League, and the Tubeway Army. The rest is history, as they say, and this is where my story begins, with my first gig on the 20th of November 1980, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark at the Liverpool Empire. Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, or OMD as they're probably better known by, hail from Mells on the Wirral, and had previously been in bands called the ID and VCL11. The early lineup comprised of Andrew McCluskey on vocals and bass guitar, and Paul Humphreys on synthesizers. And they also included a TIAC reel-to-reel tape machine called Winston, named after the character in George Orwell's novel 1984. The band had played a couple of early gigs at Eric's in Liverpool, but were never made to feel welcome there. They were seen as outsiders, coming as they did from the other side of the River Mersey. Their music was different, electronic and very German influenced. They had both been present to see Kraftwerk at the Liverpool Empire in September 1975, a day that Andrew McCluskey recalls as the first day of the rest of his life. Having played a number of gigs at Eric's, the owner, Roger Eagle, suggested they look for a gig in Manchester. The band secured a gig at the Factory in Manchester in October 1978, supporting Cabaret Voltaire, and handed a demo of a tune called Electricity to Tony Wilson, head of Factory Records. Wilson had no time for the track. However, Lindsay Reed, his wife at the time, really liked it. Eventually Tony agreed to release it for her. Tony was much more into punk than Lindsay, who had a greater pop sensibility. Peter Saville, the label's in-house designer, was also very enthused and loved the demo. He later suggested that Tony didn't like the band because they were from Liverpool and he was instinctively antagonistic towards them. Saville was more interested in the name, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, and straight away he had a sleeve in mind. More about that shortly. Tony Wilson offered OMD a one single deal and thought it would give them the platform to sign to a major label. Possibly the first of many unbusinesslike decisions that Tony made over the next 15 years. Electricity and the B-side, Almost, were recorded at Cargo Studios in Rochdale, with Martin Hannett at the controls. OMD thought Hannett was a bit on the weird side, and he scared the hell out of them. They also hated Hannett's versions of the songs, which they described as less poppy and far too laid back, and accused Hannett of drowning both tracks in echo and turning Almost into a totally lethargic ballad. Hannett's version of Electricity was eventually rejected by OMD, and their original version was issued as a 7-inch single, catalogued by Factory Records as FAC 6. The Electricity sleeve design by Peter Saville was revolutionary at the time, and probably still is. It featured a late period Chishold typeface printed in black thermographic ink on a matte black background. The design emulated Braille, a tactile writing system used by people who are visually impaired, and was thus legible in the dark. The sleeve also featured background musical notation, inspired by a book of avant-garde musical scores that Saville had found in Llandudno Public Library. The novel thermographic printing process triggered 3 small fires on the shop floor of the deeply sceptical Manchester printer, who, however, afterwards expressed his delight at the finished article. All 5,000 copies of Electricity sold out within a matter of months. It was applauded in the NME as melodic synthesizer pop that offered serious competition to the Human League. The Melody Maker praised it as a perfect 80s pop record and loved the very suave black-on-black Touch Me Braille sleeve. The sounds, however, were much more negative, with punk Luddite Gary Bushell concluding that if Mike Oldfield were 10 years younger and he was a Tubeway Army fan, this is what he would sound like, adding, who wants to listen to a bunch of scousers whining on about electricity anyway? OMD eventually signed to Dindisc, a subsidiary of Virgin Records, for a reputed £250,000, which was enough to help them build their own recording studio, the Gramophone Suite. They released their self-titled debut album in early 1980, with Peter Saville again at the helm, sharing the sleeve design responsibilities with interior designer Ben Kelly, who later went on to design the Hacienda nightclub in Manchester. The design was based on a door that Kelly had designed for a boutique called Howie's in Covent Garden, London. It featured a die-cut grid of lozenges, through which the orange inner sleeve was visible. Saville and Kelly won a Designer and Art Directors Award for their work on the album, and the die-cut process would be replicated 3 years later on New Order's epic 12-inch single Blue Monday. OMD's second album, Organisation, was released in the autumn of the same year and included their first top 10 single, Enola Gay, the Liverpool gig being one of the dates on the tour to promote OMD's second album. After purchasing my ticket for a hefty £3 some weeks earlier, the date had finally arrived. I headed over to Liverpool straight after school and was outside the venue a full 3 hours before the doors were due to open. It was eerily quiet, although I do recall seeing Paul Humphreys pop his head out of the stage door to hand some complimentary tickets to one of his friends as I loitered around, hoping to catch a glimpse of the band. And so, finally, to the gig itself. OMD was supported by Fatal Charm, who had formed in Nottingham a couple of years earlier. I don't recall being particularly impressed by their post-punk musings, which also coincidentally featured a live reel-to-reel tape machine. Google confirms that Fatal Charm's singer, Sarah Simmons, later went on to provide backing vocals for Bjork at the 2004 Olympic Games opening ceremony. During the interval, I sat quietly in anticipation whilst the venue played a fine selection of electronic tunes, most of which I had never heard before. I remember being mesmerised by one particular tune, which I later found out was Hall of Mirrors by Kraftwerk. I can oddly still remember the weird, trance-like state I was in when I heard the song for the first time, not having a clue what it was or indeed who it was by. OMD's sound crew were clearly wearing their influences on their sleeves to warm up the packed Empire Theatre. It was quickly followed by an absolute oddball of a song with squelchy synth riffs and a lyric that appeared to be about cigarettes. The track was Tar by Visage, which within a year would join my fledgling record collection after I had purchased their debut album following their top 10 success with Fade to Grey. OMD came on in front of their home crowd and were joined on stage by Malcolm Holmes on drums and Martin Cooper on keys. Winston, the aforementioned TIAC reel-to-reel, was unfortunately nowhere to be seen, having retired 12 months earlier. They played all but 3 tracks off their first 2 albums, including my favourites at the time, Julia's Song and Electricity, plus a couple of B-sides. They also played second single, Red Frame White Light, OMD's homage to a telephone box with the number 632-3003. 30 years later, whilst listening to their first album, after having one too many, I decided to call the very same number with the obligatory 0151 prefix to see if anyone would answer it. Expecting a drunk walking home from the local boozer to pick up my call, to my surprise, a rather well-spoken old-age pensioner answered, exclaiming, "Mel's 3003." I proceeded to tell him about the significance of his landline telephone number, whilst he repeatedly asked, "I'm sorry, who am I talking to?" before then threatening to call the police. OMD ended the gig with a song called Waiting for the Man, which 3 or 4 years later I would learn was a Velvet Underground track taken from their Nico album. The gig itself influenced my musical direction for the next few years as I sought out synth pop and music that fell out of the London Blitz Kids and New Romantic scenes. As part of this series, I will be composing a cover version from each episode's featured band. You'll find my cover of Almost, the B-side to OMD's first single, during the closing credits at the end of the programme. Thanks for watching. Our next instalment should land sometime in early May, celebrating 40 years since I attended my second ever gig.
trouble